We basically just get 90-degree cuts on here. If we need an angle cut, it's easier to use the miter saw. The thing that I do love about this saw is if you only need to cut like a groove in the board, you can raise, oops, if I go the right way, you can raise the saw up by cranking this clockwise, and then it's gonna cut roughly halfway through this board right now. Right, so if I needed like a groove on here to fit another board into here, I could use this to make that perfect depth to fit another board if we needed to like lock two boards together that way. But typically, if you have, if you have a long board, this is where I like to start it. Because this table is really nice for really long boards. So if you need to cut down a long board, this is a perfect way to go. Or if you just need a 90-degree angle, this is a great way to start as well. The tricky thing about this saw is where you mark it. So, here actually I'll switch this. This will be better. So if I need to cut 4 inches off of this board, I can mark it on here, and if I mark it in the center, and then I try and put it on here, it's not gonna work out well. It's not gonna be perfectly 4 inches, right? I'm gonna be a little off. So anytime you mark it with this saw, you wanna mark it on the side, right? And I also like to mark which side I don't need, right? So if I need this 4 inches, I'm gonna put a little X over here, and I'm gonna know that the outside edge of this saw blade needs to be directly in line with my 4-inch mark, right? Because if I cut it on this side of the saw, my board is actually gonna be a little less than 4 inches. It's gonna be 1/8. The blade is about 1/8 of an inch thick, so that board's gonna be a little short. So be aware of that. Or the other thing that a lot of students will do is they're like, oh, I need 4 pieces at 4 inches. So I'm gonna mark 4, oops, let's see if I can do this, 8 and 12. If I make all 3 of those cuts, are all of these gonna be 4 inches? No, how come? Absolutely, right? The blade is thicker. So after I cut this one's only gonna be 3 7/8, right? And then this one's gonna be 3 3/4, right? So each time I'm gonna lose 1/8 of an inch. So they're not all gonna be the same. So if you need multiple pieces off of the same board at the same length, cut it, remeasure, and cut it again. So every time you have to measure before you cut. When we use this saw, we wanna make sure everything gets lined up, right? So if I want this 4-inch blade, the thing that I do like about it is you can line it up before ever using your brain or thinking about it, right? So you just line it up perfectly with the outside edge of the saw if you need this side, or the inside edge of the saw if you need the other side. And then I can just lock it with my left hand. When I push with my left hand, I'm pushing hard against the back of the fence and against the base. I have a general rule of these 2 bolts here being the no finger zone. Right, so I don't want to see your fingers in between these bolts and this line here. So if you ever need to cut something small, we can kind of like set up some boards and a clamp and lock it in place so that you don't have to actually hold that teeny tiny board in place, and it keeps your fingers really far away from the saw. And so when you start, you've checked and make sure that your saw blade is gonna be right on your line. You don't wanna leave the saw blade on the board. Whenever we start it, we wanna make sure it's pushed back, that when the saw blade starts, it's not gonna hit the board as it starts. And then on and off is right here, this red button. So you have to pull this out, and then we're just slowly gonna pull it in. Oops. And I didn't adjust the height correctly. I gotta go a little lower. And then we're all done. Right, so now we have our 4-inch piece. If you are ever cutting anything really thin, right? If I just need to take a little edge off of this board, like this much, I cut it just a little too long, so I have to cut a little bit off. I'm gonna turn it on, I'm gonna make that cut, I'm gonna turn it off, and I'm not gonna touch that little piece or the saw until it fully comes to a stop. Why, Jasper? Do you remember? It'll make a flying, right? So if I just push this right back, that little piece might go across the room and hit somebody, or it might get sucked up into the saw here and get jammed in the saw blade, and then I kind of have to take this apart to get this one little piece out of there. So it makes this machine go down for a little while until I finally have time to fix it. Questions?